Picture a world where doctors prescribed smoking as a cure for asthma, where people believed tomatoes were poisonous, and where carrying a dead mole in your pocket was considered the best way to ward off toothaches. These aren't the ramblings of a medieval fantasy novel. They were once widely accepted truths. History is littered with beliefs so bizarre, so wildly out of step with what we know today, that they almost defy logic. Yet for centuries, people clung to these ideas with absolute conviction, shaping their lives, their health, and even their laws around them. What's even more fascinating is how these beliefs didn't just spring up out of nowhere. They were often rooted in the best knowledge of the time, supported by respected scholars, and passed down through generations as undeniable facts. Imagine living in an era where the line between science and superstition was blurred, where the unexplainable was explained in ways that now seem laughable or downright horrifying. From bizarre medical remedies to cosmic misunderstandings about the universe, our ancestors' attempts to make sense of their world often led them down some truly strange paths. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, 25 of the most outrageous, mind-boggling beliefs from history that make you wonder, how did anyone ever think that? Some of these ideas might make you chuckle, others might leave you stunned, but all of them reveal how far we've come and how easy it is to take our modern understanding for granted. So, if you're ready for a journey through time where logic takes a backseat and curiosity runs wild, stick around, because by the end of this, you'll never look at history or the present quite the same way again. Long before satellites mapped our planet or telescopes peered into deep space, civilizations across the globe wrestled with a simple yet profound question: what holds up the Earth? One of the most enduring answers came not from equations or experiments, but from mythology. Picture a cosmic turtle, its shell vast enough to cradle continents, its slow, steady movements explaining earthquakes and the turning of the seasons. This wasn't just a whimsical tale told around campfires for countless cultures. It was the foundation of their understanding of the universe. Hindu cosmology describes a divine tortoise named Accupaura, supporting not just the earth but also a stack of elephants and serpents beneath it, all floating in an endless cosmic ocean. Meanwhile, in certain Native American traditions like the Lenape and Iroquois, the great turtle's back became the very ground where the first humans walked after the world was formed from mud dredged up from primordial waters. Over in China, legends spoke of a giant sea turtle named Ao, whose legs stabilized the heavens while its shell bore the weight of the world. What makes these stories so fascinating isn't just their shared imagery, it's how they reflect the values and fears of the societies that created them. Turtles symbolized longevity, stability, and resilience, qualities ancient people saw mirrored in the earth itself. When they imagined their world resting on such a creature, they weren't just explaining physics. They were placing themselves within a living, breathing universe, one where nature's rhythms made sense in ways that felt personal and sacred. Of course, not every culture envisioned the same creature. Some myths replaced the turtle with a serpent, a boar, or even a cosmic bull. Yet the underlying idea persisted, that the Earth wasn't just floating in empty space, but held up by something powerful, something alive. Today, we might chuckle at the thought of a planetary tortoise, but these beliefs reveal something deeper: our ancestors' desperate, beautiful need to make sense of the incomprehensible, to find order in chaos, and to see the world not as a cold, indifferent void, but as a place brimming with meaning. Imagine living in a time when something as simple as a sneeze could send you into a panic, not because of germs, but because people genuinely believed your soul might escape through your nose. This wasn't just a quirky folk tale. For centuries across Europe, sneezing was thought to be a moment of extreme vulnerability, when the body's sudden convulsion could literally expel the soul from a person's body. And it wasn't just the soul at risk. Many feared that an empty body, even for a split second, was an open invitation for demons to rush in and take control. This belief traces back to ancient times, with roots in Greek and Roman medical theories about the breath of life. But it truly took hold during the horrors of the bubonic plague in the 14th century, when sneezing was one of the first symptoms of the disease. As millions died, people scrambled for explanations and protections, saying, "God bless you," after a sneeze wasn't just polite, it was a desperate prayer, a verbal shield against evil spirits. Some went even further, clutching charms or making the sign of the cross to seal the body against supernatural intrusion. What's remarkable is how this superstition clung to life long after medicine advanced. Even Renaissance scholars like Leonardo da Vinci speculated about the connection between sneezing and the soul. And while we now know sneezing is just a reflex to clear irritants from our nose, the tradition of blessing sneezers persists, testament to how deeply fear and folklore can embed themselves in culture. Next time someone says, "Bless you," remember, you're hearing an echo of a time when humanity saw danger in something as ordinary as a tickle in the nose. One of history's most baffling food myths began with something as innocent as a tomato, a plump, red, and bursting with flavor. Yet in 18th century Europe, this now beloved fruit was so feared that people called it the poison apple. The reason: a perfect storm of superstition, misunderstood science, and a quirk of chemistry involving the dinnerware of the wealthy. Back then, tomatoes were newcomers to European tables, brought from the Americas by explorers. But their acidic juice had an unsettling reaction with pewter plates, the fancy serving ware of aristocrats. When tomato acids leached lead from the pewter, it caused nausea, dizziness, and even death. Instead of blaming the toxic plates, people pointed fingers at the tomato itself, convinced it was cursed. Rumors spread that just touching the plant could give you rashes, and eating one would doom you to a gruesome end. The fruit became a symbol of distrust, stuck with nicknames like Wolf's Peach, hinting at its supposed deadly nature. But the real irony: while the wealthy shunned tomatoes, the poor who ate off wooden plates had been enjoying them safely for generations. It wasn't until the 19th century that a daring few, like American Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson, decided to challenge the myth head-on. Legend says he stood on the steps of a courthouse in New Jersey and ate an entire basket of tomatoes in front of a horrified crowd, just to prove they wouldn't kill him. Slowly, the truth won out, and tomatoes went from feared to fashionable, becoming the backbone of cuisines worldwide. Looking back, it's a stark reminder of how quickly misinformation can take root and how hard it can be to uproot. Imagine how different Italian food or ketchup would be if that myth had never been debunked. Sometimes, history's most absurd beliefs aren't just amusing, they're cautionary tales about the cost of assumptions. During the frenzy of Europe's witch trials, few accusations were as shocking or as revealing as the claim that witches could make men's genitals vanish with a wave of their hands. Court records from the 15th to 17th centuries are filled with testimonies from terrified men who swore their bodies had been mutilated by magic, their most intimate parts stolen away and hidden in bird nests, boxes, or even, according to one particularly vivid account, inside a loaf of bread. These stories weren't just isolated tall tales. They reflected deep-seated anxieties about masculinity, power, and control in a society where witchcraft hysteria ran rampant. Many of the accusers were men who, in a time before modern medicine, might have suffered from erectile dysfunction, infertility, or even psychological conditions like conversion disorder. Faced with the shame of failing to perform as expected, they pointed to supernatural explanations rather than confront personal or societal vulnerabilities. But the symbolism went even deeper. In a world where women were often scapegoated for male misfortunes, the idea of witches collecting male organs played into fears of female dominance. Some trial documents described witches hoarding stolen genitals like trophies, turning them into grotesque symbols of inverted power. One German woodcut from the 16th century even depicted witches gleefully tossing severed members into a tree, reinforcing the idea that men's very identities could be stripped away by female magic. What makes these accusations so chilling is how eagerly authorities entertained them. Confessions were extracted under torture, and proof was manufactured, like the infamous case where a judge demanded a suspect would return a missing organ, only to declare victory when a confused woman handed over a random object. The hysteria wasn't just about superstition. It was a tool of control, reinforcing gender hierarchies by painting women as threats to the natural order. Looking back, these beliefs seem absurd, even darkly comedic, but they expose a timeless truth. When fear takes hold, people will invent monsters rather than face their own frailties. The witch trials weren't just about magic, they were a mirror held up to society's deepest insecurities, reflecting anxieties that, in some ways, we still grapple with today. The idea of grinding up ancient corpses and swallowing them might sound like something from a horror movie, but in Renaissance Europe it was cutting-edge medicine. For nearly 300 years, from the 16th to the 18th century, pharmacies across the continent stocked a bizarre ingredient-powdered Egyptian mummies. This wasn't some fringe remedy peddled by charlatans. It was endorsed by respected physicians who believed these preserved bodies held miraculous healing properties. The craze started when European traders brought back mummies from Egypt, where they had been dug up in vast numbers. Not just pharaohs, but ordinary people whose bodies had been mummified over millennia. Doctors claimed this blackened, tar-like substance could cure everything from headaches to the plague, thanks to its supposed embalming resins. Recipes even specified which parts of the mummy were most potent: skull for brain ailments, flesh for general sickness, and patients drank it mixed into wine, applied it as a paste, or inhaled it like snuff. But the demand soon outstripped supply. As real mummies grew scarce, a grisly black market emerged. Unscrupulous merchants faked them by drying fresh corpses in the sun or coating them with bitumen to mimic the ancient look. Some even passed off the bodies of executed criminals as authentic mummies, capitalizing on the desperation of the sick. What's truly chilling is how long this practice persisted. Even as Enlightenment thinkers began questioning old superstitions, mummy powder stayed in medical texts. It took modern chemistry to finally debunk the myth, revealing that the curative resins were often just decayed tissue and carcinogenic tar with no medicinal value at all. Yet buried in this macabre history is a sobering lesson about human nature. Faced with illness, people will grasp at anything that offers hope, even if it means consuming the dead. Today, we might shudder at the thought, but remember, in another 300 years, some of our own medical beliefs could seem just as shocking. In medieval Europe, justice wasn't just for humans, it extended to animals in the most bizarre way imaginable. Picture a courtroom where the defendant wasn't a thief or a murderer, but a pig dressed in human clothes standing trial for allegedly killing a child. Or imagine a swarm of locusts being formally excommunicated by a priest for destroying crops. These weren't isolated jokes or folk tales. They were real legal proceedings, complete with lawyers, witnesses, and even executions. The most infamous case dates back to 1457 in the French town of Savigny, where a sow and her 6 piglets were charged with murder after a toddler was found mauled to death. Witnesses testified the mother pig was found guilty, and she was publicly hanged by the town's executioner, while the piglets, deemed too young to understand their crimes, were spared. Records show that animals accused of everything from theft to assault were given the same legal rights as people, including defense counsel. Rats destroying grain. They'd receive a summons to appear in court, though authorities often struggled to serve them. But why go to such lengths? The answer lies in a mix of theology and medieval logic. The church taught that animals, like humans, were part of God's creation, and if they could be tempted by the devil, they could also be held accountable for sinful acts. Some legal scholars argued that animal trials were necessary to purify the community, as a criminal beast was seen as a vessel of evil that could bring divine wrath upon a village. Others believed these spectacles served as moral lessons, reinforcing societal order by showing that no act of chaos, whether by man or beast, would go unpunished. The absurdity peaked in the 16th century when entire animal populations faced prosecution. In one Swiss town, a colony of weevils ruining vineyards was assigned a lawyer who argued successfully that the insects were simply following God's command to multiply. The court ruled they could keep a portion of the crops as their rightful share. Meanwhile, in France, moles were put on trial for damaging farmland, with a priest solemnly ordering them to leave or face excommunication. What's startling is how seriously these trials were taken. Judges wore their finest robes, scribes meticulously recorded verdicts, and crowds gathered to witness the spectacle. For modern observers, it's easy to dismiss these cases as superstitious folly, but they reveal something profound about how pre-scientific societies grappled with chaos. When famine or disease struck, blaming a scapegoat, even a four-legged one, provided a sense of control in an unpredictable world. By the 18th century, animal trials had dwindled as Enlightenment thinking shifted perceptions of nature's role. But their legacy lingers in unexpected ways, from modern debates over animal rights to the symbolic weight we still place on creatures in folklore and lore. Next time you swat a fly, consider this: 600 years ago, that insect might have had its day in court. For centuries, the key to good health wasn't found in a microscope or a lab. It was written in the balance of four mysterious fluids sloshing inside the human body. Ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen swore by the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each was thought to govern not just physical health but personality traits, moods, and even destinies. Too much blood, you'd be overly cheerful, even reckless. Excess black bile, welcome to melancholy and despair. This wasn't just medical speculation, it was a framework that shaped everything from diets to surgeries, often with terrifying consequences. Take bloodletting, one of the most enduring and dangerous practices born from this belief. Doctors reasoned that if illness stemmed from an imbalance, draining the excess humor would restore harmony. Surgeons used leeches, lancets, or even cups heated to create suction, drawing out pints of blood to treat everything from fevers to fatigue. The logic seemed sound at the time, but the results were often disastrous. George Washington's death is a grim example. Historians believe the massive bloodletting he received for a throat infection hastened his end, not cured it. Yet for over 2,000 years, this practice persisted, championed by figures like medieval barber surgeons who doubled as haircutters and vein openers. What's even more surprising is how deeply the humors influenced daily life. Food wasn't just nutrition, it was medicine. If you were too choleric, dominated by yellow bile, you'd be prescribed cooling foods like cucumbers to temper your fiery temper. Phlegmatic types, sluggish and dull, were urged to eat spicy dishes to stir their energies. These ideas seeped into language too. We still call someone sanguine, from the Latin for blood, to describe optimism, or bilious to signal irritability, echoes of a theory that once ruled medicine. The real tragedy, though, wasn't just the misguided treatment, it's how the humoral theory stifled medical progress. For generations, dissecting bodies was taboo because it might disturb the humors, leaving physicians to guess at anatomy. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, many blamed miasma, bad air, instead of fleas, because the idea of invisible pathogens didn't fit their fluid-based worldview. It wasn't until the Renaissance, with pioneers like Andreas Vesalius sketching accurate organs, and later Louis Pasteur proving germ theory, that science began to unravel the myth. Yet buried in this archaic system is a glimmer of insight we still honor today. The mind and body are deeply connected. Modern psychosomatic medicine acknowledges stress can cause ulcers, just as ancient Greeks linked emotions to health. We've replaced bile and phlegm with neurotransmitters and hormones, but the core idea remains balance matters. The four humors may belong in history books, but they remind us how far we've come and how easy it is to cling to explanations that feel true, even when the evidence says otherwise. One of the most insidious myths in history began with a simple mistranslation, one that would literally reshape how entire generations pictured an entire people. In the 4th century, Saint Jerome was working on the Latin Vulgate, his monumental translation of the Bible, when he encountered a Hebrew term in Exodus describing Moses descending Mount Sinai. The original text used the word Karen, meaning radiant or shining, to describe Moses' face after encountering God, but Jerome rendered it as cornuta, horned. Suddenly, thanks to this linguistic slip, scripture seemed to suggest Moses had horns. At first, this wasn't necessarily malicious. Early Christian art sometimes depicted Moses with small, almost halo-like protrusions, symbolizing divine connection. But by the Middle Ages, that artistic choice twisted into something darker. As anti-Semitism spread across Europe, the horned Moses morphed into a grotesque stereotype applied to all Jewish people. Medieval carvings and paintings began showing Jews with curled, devilish horns, often accompanied by hooked noses and malevolent expressions. The message was clear: these were not just different people, they were sinister, even demonic. The impact was devastating. This imagery seeped into sermons, fueling blood libels, false accusations that Jews murdered Christian children for rituals. It justified expulsions like England's edict in 1290 and brutal massacres during the Crusades. When Michelangelo sculpted his famous Moses in the 16th century, he included small horns, not out of malice but because Jerome's translation was still the standard. Yet by then, the damage was done. The association had poisoned European consciousness for centuries. What makes this myth so chilling is how easily a mistake became weaponized. Language, art, and religion intertwined to create a lie so pervasive that even well-intentioned people perpetuated it. And while we now recognize the absurdity of literal horns, the lesson lingers. Stereotypes, once embedded, are monstrously hard to uproot. The horns may have been fictional, but the pain they caused was painfully real. In ancient Greece, one of medicine's most baffling and damaging theories claimed that a woman's uterus wasn't firmly anchored inside her body but could wander freely like a restless animal. Physicians like Hippocrates and Plato seriously argued that the womb could detach and roam upward toward the liver, downward toward the legs, or even press against the heart or lungs, causing everything from sudden fainting spells to uncontrollable emotions. This so-called wandering womb theory wasn't just speculative fantasy. It became the foundation for diagnosing and treating women's health for over 1,000 years, with consequences that echo into modern medicine. The symptoms attributed to this mobile organ read like a catalogue of female suffering: anxiety, insomnia, suffocating sensations, even erratic behavior. Ancient doctors believed the uterus, deprived of pregnancy, its so-called natural purpose, would grow restless, migrating through the body and squeezing other organs. The prescribed cures were as bizarre as the diagnosis. Physicians recommended placing foul-smelling substances near a woman's nose to drive the womb back down with stench, or sweet perfumes near her thighs to lure it into place. Some treatments involved elaborate herbal poultices, while others relied on crude mechanical interventions, like shaking the patient violently to jostle the uterus back into position. What's most disturbing isn't just the absurdity of the theory, it's how easily it justified the dismissal of women's pain. Any complaint that couldn't be explained was labeled hysteria, a term derived from the Greek word for uterus, hystera. This diagnosis became a catch-all for everything from epilepsy to depression, reinforcing the idea that women's bodies were inherently unstable, even dangerous. By the Middle Ages, the wandering womb had evolved into a tool of control. with male physicians asserting authority over female patients whose symptoms were often framed as moral failings, proof of excessive passion, sexual frustration, or disobedience. The legacy of this belief is staggering. Well into the 19th century, women undergoing hysterical episodes were subjected to barbaric treatments, from forced hysterectomies to institutionalization in asylums. Even the invention of the vibrator in the 1800s was tied to this myth. Doctors used early models to manually induce paroxysms, orgasms in female patients, convinced it would calm their unruly wombs. It took the rise of modern neurology and psychology to finally dismantle the idea, yet traces lingered. Freud famously reframed hysteria as a psychological condition, but even his theories blamed women's repressed desires, perpetuating the same old narrative under a new name. Today, we recognize how deeply sexism polluted medical science, but the damage wasn't just historical. The wandering womb myth set a precedent for dismissing women's pain as exaggeration or emotional weakness, a bias that persists in emergency rooms where women's heart attack symptoms are still more likely to be downplayed, or in studies showing female pain is systematically undertreated compared to men's. The womb might not wander anymore in textbooks, but its ghost haunts how medicine sees or overlooks women's bodies. For nearly 2,000 years, the brightest minds of the Western world insisted on a fundamental truth so deeply ingrained it seemed beyond question. The Earth stood motionless at the center of the universe, with the sun, planets, and stars obediently circling around us. This geocentric model, meticulously refined by the ancient Greek astronomer Ptolemy in the 2nd century, wasn't just scientific consensus. It was woven into the very fabric of philosophy, religion, and daily life. Ptolemy's intricate system of epicycles, tiny circles within circles, explained away inconsistencies in planetary motion so convincingly that even when observations didn't quite match, scholars tweaked the math rather than question the premise. The real weight of this belief became clear when Nicolaus Copernicus, a Polish cleric and astronomer, dared to propose a radical alternative in 1543. His heliocentric theory placed the sun at the center, with Earth relegated to just another planet in motion. But publishing his work wasn't just a scientific gamble, it was a theological grenade. The Catholic Church, which had long integrated Ptolemy's model into its teachings, saw Copernicus's idea as an assault on divine order. After all, if Earth wasn't central, what did that mean for humanity's special place in God's creation? Scripture itself seemed to support geocentrism, with verses like Psalm 93 declaring, "The world is established, it shall never be moved." Resistance wasn't just institutional, it was personal. Astronomers like Tycho Brahe, whose precise observations later helped prove heliocentrism, rejected the idea outright, clinging to a hybrid model where planets orbited the sun while the sun still circled Earth. Even Galileo, whose telescope revealed moons orbiting Jupiter, direct evidence against Earth's uniqueness, faced the Inquisition's wrath in 1633. Forced to recant under threat of torture, he spent his final years under house arrest, whispering legend has it, and yet it moves. What's fascinating isn't just the science, but the psychology behind the backlash. Geocentrism wasn't merely incorrect, it was comforting. It flattered human vanity, placing us at the cosmic center, the literal focus of God's attention. Letting go of that privilege required more than new math. It demanded humility, a willingness to accept that we inhabited not a grand stage, but a speck adrift in an unimaginably vast universe. That shift in perspective, more than any equation, was the real revolution Copernicus ignited. Yet the story's irony is richer still. Long before Europe's scholars debated, other cultures had already glimpsed the truth. In ancient India, Aryabhatta proposed a rotating Earth in the 5th century, while Islamic astronomers like Al-Sijazi designed instruments based on Earth's motion. Even the Greek Aristarchus speculated about heliocentrism centuries before Ptolemy, but his ideas were dismissed as ludicrous. The past whispers a sobering lesson. Sometimes the biggest obstacle to progress isn't ignorance, but the weight of what we think we already know. Few creatures have suffered a reputation as darkly undeserved as the common house cat. In medieval Europe, these aloof, independent animals weren't just misunderstood, they were downright demonized. Church authorities and frightened peasants alike became convinced that cats, especially black ones, were supernatural spies, the favored familiars of witches and agents of Satan himself. This wasn't just idle superstition, it sparked a mass feline genocide with horrifying, unintended consequences. The roots of this hysteria stretch back to Pope Gregory IX's infamous 1233 papal bull, Vox in Roma, which declared black cats to be literal incarnations of the devil. The document described heretical rituals where Satan allegedly appeared as a half-cat, half-man hybrid, luring worshippers into unspeakable acts. From that moment, cats, once revered in ancient Egypt as divine protectors, became living symbols of sin. Their nocturnal habits, glowing eyes, and unnerving silence fed the paranoia, making them perfect scapegoats for unexplained misfortunes. If a child fell ill or crops failed, a cat lurking nearby was often blamed. But the true tragedy unfolded during the Black Death. As the plague ravaged Europe in the 1300s, panicked mobs slaughtered cats by the thousands, convinced they were spreading the disease through demonic magic. Towns organized mass burnings of cats, sometimes tossing them alive into bonfires during festivals. The irony: by exterminating their natural pest controllers, humans unwittingly unleashed the real culprits, rats. With fewer cats to hunt them, rat populations exploded, their fleas spreading the bubonic plague faster than ever. Some historians argue this knee-jerk persecution of cats may have worsened the death toll, turning a catastrophe into an apocalypse. The madness didn't stop there. During witch trials, accused women were routinely interrogated about their familiar spirits, often described as shape-shifting cats who did their bidding. Court records from Scotland to Switzerland detail chilling testimonies of cats speaking in human voices or vanishing into thin air. One poor woman in France, Jean Bastow, was burned at the stake in 1590 after neighbors swore her black cat was seen crawling into her mouth at night to steal her soul. What's striking is how these beliefs reflected deeper anxieties. Cats, with their untamed nature and refusal to obey like dogs, threatened the rigid hierarchies of medieval life. Their ability to see in the dark symbolized forbidden knowledge, while their purring was sometimes interpreted as whispered spells. Even their biology worked against them. The tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer in cat eyes that makes them glow, was cited as proof they harbored hellfire within. Yet amid the terror, glimpses of resistance emerged. Sailors, superstitious in their own right, kept cats aboard ships to control vermin, valuing their utility over church dogma. And in rural pockets, cats quietly survived as beloved mousers, their practical benefits outweighing fear. Slowly, as the witch craze faded and science advanced, cats clawed their way back into favor, but the shadow of those dark centuries lingers. Today's Halloween imagery of black cats as omens, that's no accident. It's the echo of an era when humanity's fear of the unknown turned a graceful, enigmatic creature into a monster. For most of human history, being left-handed wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. In cultures across the globe, left-handedness carried a sinister reputation, marking people as anything from unlucky to outright demonic. The very word sinister comes from the Latin sinistra, meaning left, while dexterous, meaning skillful, derives from dexter or right. This linguistic bias was just the beginning. From ancient Rome to medieval Europe, left-handed children were often beaten or tied down to force them to use their right hands, while some societies believed southpaws bore the literal mark of the devil. The roots of this fear run deep. In Christian tradition, the right hand symbolized righteousness. Jesus sat at God's right hand while the damned were cast to the left. Islamic teachings encouraged using the right hand for eating and greeting, as the left was reserved for unclean tasks. Even non-religious superstitions linked left-handedness to bad omens. In Japan, wives could be divorced for being left-handed, while some African tribes viewed it as a curse requiring ritual purification. The harshest persecution came during the witch trials, where left-handedness was considered proof of a pact with Satan. Records show accused witches like England's Mother Lakeland, burned in 1645, were interrogated specifically about which hand they used, with left-handedness treated as damning evidence. But the cruelty wasn't just supernatural. Well into the 20th century, schools in Europe and America practiced systematic retraining, forcing left-handed children to write with their right hands. Teachers used rulers, straps, and even wooden restraints to immobilize the wrong hand. Psychologists of the era claimed left-handedness caused stuttering or mental illness, and medical journals published warnings about its supposed links to criminality. Charles Darwin's own son was subjected to this torment, his left hand tied behind his back for hours, a practice so common it spawned the phrase, "to rule with a heavy hand." Yet buried in this history is a fascinating irony. Many of history's greatest innovators, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Marie Curie, were left-handed. Some scholars now argue that forced right-handedness suppressed natural cognitive strengths linked to left-handers' unique brain wiring. The tide only began turning in the 1960s when research debunked the myths and activists campaigned against forced retraining. Today, left-handedness is celebrated in events like International Left-Handers Day, and tools from scissors to guitars are finally designed for southpaws. What makes this shift remarkable isn't just the end of persecution, it's how recently it happened. The last U.S. classrooms to abandon forced retraining did so in the 1980s. Some cultures still carry traces of the old stigma. In parts of the Middle East and Asia, using the left hand for eating remains taboo. But overall, humanity has moved from seeing left-handedness as a curse to recognizing it as simply another thread in our diverse genetic tapestry. The next time you struggle with a right-handed can opener, remember, you're facing the last echoes of a prejudice once taken as gospel. Picture a world where your future wasn't written in the stars, but in the bumps and ridges of your own skull. That's exactly what phrenologists in the 19th century promised, a so-called science claiming it could map your personality, talents, and even criminal tendencies simply by measuring the contours of your head. This bizarre belief, known as phrenology, swept through Europe and America like an intellectual fever, influencing everything from education to law enforcement. But beneath its veneer of rationality lay a dangerous pseudoscience that justified racism, fueled prejudice, and left a stain on history that still lingers today. The founder of this movement, German physician Franz Joseph Gall, wasn't some back-alley quack. He was a respected anatomist who theorized that different brain regions controlled specific traits, from kindness to aggression. He argued these traits would visibly distort the skull, creating detectable lumps. His disciple, Johann Spurzheim, turned these ideas into a full-blown cultural phenomenon, lecturing to packed halls and publishing best-selling books. Soon, phrenology parlors popped up in major cities, where practitioners would run their fingers over clients' heads like fortune tellers reading palms, diagnosing everything from poor parenting skills to a predisposition for theft. What made phrenology so seductive was its false sense of precision. Practitioners produced elaborate skull maps divided into dozens of organs, each labeled with traits like destructiveness behind the ears or benevolence at the forehead. Charts assigned numerical scores, giving the illusion of objective measurement. Judges consulted phrenologists before sentencing criminals. Employers used it to screen job applicants, and even parents had their children's skulls assessed to guide career choices. The craze reached absurd heights. One London newspaper advertised phrenology-based marriage compatibility readings, while Harvard University briefly considered making it part of its medical curriculum. But the darkest chapter of phrenology wasn't its absurdity, it was how easily it was weaponized. As the Atlantic slave trade raged, pro-slavery advocates seized on phrenology to prove the supposed intellectual inferiority of Africans, pointing to skull measurements as evidence. Criminologists like Cesare Lombroso used it to argue that certain facial features like sloping foreheads or prominent jaws were born criminal traits, leading to racial profiling and harsh sentencing. Women, too, were targeted. Phrenologists claimed their skulls showed smaller, intellectual organs, justifying their exclusion from higher education. The downfall of phrenology came not from moral outrage, but from cold, hard science. As neurology advanced, researchers like Pierre Flourens demonstrated that brain functions weren't neatly localized in the way Gall claimed. Skull shape, it turned out, had no correlation with personality, a fact cemented when studies showed identical twins with nearly identical heads could have wildly different temperaments. By the early 20th century, phrenology had been relegated to carnival sideshows, though its echoes persisted in discredited theories like eugenics. Yet the ghost of phrenology still haunts us. Modern technologies like AI personality prediction or genetic screening sometimes fall into the same trap, mistaking correlation for causation, or reducing complex human traits to simplistic measurements. The next time you see a viral quiz claiming to analyze your character based on some arbitrary metric, remember, we've been down this road before, and history shows how easily the quest to categorize people can spiral into something far more sinister. At the dawn of the 20th century, humanity stumbled upon what seemed like a miracle substance, radium. Glowing faintly in the dark, this newly discovered element captured imaginations worldwide. But this wasn't just another scientific curiosity. It became the star of one of history's most reckless health crazes. Almost overnight, radium was marketed as everything from a complexion-enhancing face cream to an invigorating tonic promising eternal youth. The irony, this wonder ingredient was slowly poisoning its devotees, unraveling one of the most tragic chapters in the history of consumer safety. The madness began when scientists Marie and Pierre Curie isolated radium in 1898, revealing its strange, luminous properties. Almost immediately, entrepreneurs saw dollar signs. If radium could kill bacteria and cancerous cells, they reasoned, surely tiny doses could supercharge vitality. By the 1920s, pharmacies stocked shelves with radium-laced toothpaste, chocolates, and even condoms, all boasting radiant health benefits. The most infamous product, Radither, was a bottled water infused with radium, aggressively advertised as a cure for the living dead. Wealthy socialites sipped it daily, convinced they were sipping liquid immortality. Doctors prescribed it for arthritis, gout, and impotence, while fashionable women dabbed radioactive powders on their cheeks for a healthy glow. But the darkest twist wasn't just the snake oil, it was the workforce that fueled it. Thousands of young women, known as the Radium Girls, were hired to paint glow in the dark numerals on watches and instrument dials. Factory managers assured them the luminous paint was harmless, even encouraging them to lick their brushes to maintain a fine point. Slowly, the workers began suffering mysterious symptoms, aching jaws, crumbling teeth, and spontaneous fractures. By the time doctors connected their ailments to radiation poisoning, many were already terminally ill. Their bones, saturated with radium, literally glowed in the dark. The backlash, when it finally came, was explosive. When Radither enthusiast and industrialist Eben Byers died gruesomely in 1932, his body so radioactive it required a lead-lined casket, the media erupted. The Federal Trade Commission cracked down on false advertising, and the Food and Drug Administration began regulating radioactive claims. Yet the damage was done. Countless lives had been sacrificed at the altar of corporate greed and scientific ignorance. What makes the radium craze so haunting isn't just the tragedy, but the warning it carries. Even today, we chase quick fixes and miracle cures, whether it's dubious supplements or unproven tech trends. Radium's story reminds us that when profit and hype outpace evidence, the consequences can be deadly. Those glowing girls didn't just fade into history, they lit the way for consumer protections we now take for granted. Their legacy glows far brighter than any radioactive quackery ever could. Long before astronauts set foot on the moon, humanity was convinced it was teeming with life. For centuries, the moon wasn't just a lifeless rock. It was a thriving world, complete with bustling cities, lunar oceans, and even alien civilizations watching us from above. This wasn't just the stuff of science fiction. Some of history's greatest minds, from renowned astronomers to celebrated authors, staked their reputations on the idea that our celestial neighbor was inhabited. The obsession began in earnest with Galileo. When he first pointed his telescope at the moon in 1609, he saw jagged mountains and dark patches he mistakenly interpreted as seas, naming them Maria Latin for seas. Though he never claimed these held life, his detailed sketches ignited imaginations. By the 17th century, astronomers like Johannes Kepler were penning elaborate stories about lunar beings building vast structures to survive their harsh environment. The famous astronomer William Herschel, discoverer of Uranus, even speculated in 1780 that the moon's surface was covered in lush forests and that its inhabitants might be observing Earth just as we observed them. But the theories grew wilder. In 1835, the New York Sun published a now infamous hoax claiming renowned astronomer Sir John Herschel had spotted bat-winged humanoids living in lunar temples through a massive telescope. The public devoured the story, and even after it was debunked, the idea stuck. Writers like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells fed the frenzy with tales of moon-dwelling selenites and fragile lunar civilizations. Meanwhile, astronomers like Franz von Paula-Gruithuisen insisted they'd glimpsed geometric patterns, evidence of sprawling lunar cities, through their telescopes. The turning point came in 1969 when Apollo 11's astronauts landed on the moon's barren surface. No cities, no forests, no bat people, just dust, rock, and silence. The myth of a living moon crumbled under the weight of reality. Yet for all its absurdity, the belief wasn't entirely foolish. In a world where every unexplored frontier had revealed life, whether in the depths of the ocean or the heart of jungles, why wouldn't the moon harbor its own? It was a testament to human curiosity, our relentless need to fill the unknown with stories. The moon's desolation may have disappointed dreamers, but it offered something even more profound: perspective. For the first time, we saw Earth not as the center of creation, but as a fragile blue dot in an unimaginably vast cosmos. The moon wasn't a mirror for our fantasies, it was a mirror for our humility. And in that way, the truth turned out to be far more awe-inspiring than fiction. Imagine a world where a single tulip bulb could buy you a grand canal house in Amsterdam, complete with servants and a carriage. This wasn't the plot of a fairy tale, it actually happened in the Dutch Golden Age, when Tulip Mania turned a simple flower into the most coveted commodity on Earth. Between 1634 and 1637, the price of tulip bulbs skyrocketed to absurd heights, creating one of history's first and most bizarre economic bubbles. At its peak, a rare bulb like the Semper Augustus could fetch as much as 10 times the annual salary of a skilled craftsman. People sold their homes, land, and life savings just to own one of these brightly colored blooms, convinced their value would only climb higher. The frenzy began innocently enough. Tulips, originally brought to Europe from the Ottoman Empire, became a status symbol among the Dutch elite. Their vivid, flame-like streaks, caused by a virus that actually weakened the plant, made them unlike any other flower. As demand grew, so did speculation. Bulbs were traded not as flowers, but as futures contracts, with buyers betting on prices rising before the next harvest. Taverns turned into makeshift trading floors, where merchants, farmers, and even chimney sweeps wagered fortunes on scribbled notes promising future bulbs. The mania reached surreal levels when one buyer reportedly traded 12 acres of farmland for a single Viceroy tulip bulb, while another exchanged an actual ship's cargo of grain for a handful of bulbs. But like all bubbles, it couldn't last. In February 1637, at the height of the craze, a group of buyers simply refused to pay the inflated prices. Panic spread like wildfire. Within days, bulbs that had been worth mansions were barely worth the dirt they grew in. Bankruptcies piled up, fortunes evaporated, and courts were swamped with lawsuits as traders demanded payment for now worthless contracts. The Dutch government stepped in, offering to settle contracts at a fraction of their peak value, just 10% in some cases, but the damage was done. Families who had mortgaged everything for tulips were left destitute, and the economy reeled for years. What makes Tulip Mania so fascinating isn't just the absurd prices, it's how little the flowers themselves mattered. Most buyers had no intention of planting tulips. They were gambling on paper promises detached from reality. The crash became a cautionary tale about the dangers of speculative greed, a warning echoed in every financial bubble since, from the South Sea Company to the dot-com frenzy. Yet buried in this madness is a peculiar irony. Today, the Netherlands is still the world's top tulip producer, exporting billions of bulbs annually. The flowers that once crashed an economy now quietly fuel one, a proof that sometimes history's wildest delusions can leave behind a surprisingly beautiful legacy. In ancient China, the humble cicada wasn't just another insect, it was the key to immortality. Emperors and alchemists alike brewed potions infused with powdered cicada shells, convinced that consuming these shimmering insects would grant eternal life. The logic wasn't entirely random. Cicadas spend years underground before emerging, molting their exoskeletons in a transformation so dramatic it seemed like magic. To the Chinese, this symbolized rebirth and transcendence, making the cicada a living emblem of cheating death. Texts from the Han Dynasty even prescribed cicada-based tonics to purify the soul and ward off decay, while jade carvings of the insects were placed in tombs to guide the deceased into the afterlife. Egyptian royalty took the bug-eating craze even further. Scarab beetles, revered as manifestations of the sun god Khepri, were ground into powders or eaten whole in rituals meant to ensure resurrection. The beetles' habit of rolling dung into perfect spheres mirrored the sun's journey across the sky, linking them to cosmic cycles of death and renewal. High priests claimed consuming scarabs would fuse the eater's soul with the gods, granting divinity. Even Cleopatra was rumored to drink a tonic of crushed beetles and honey to preserve her legendary beauty, a precursor to modern-day collagen fads. Fast forward to today, and the idea of bug eating for health doesn't seem quite so outlandish. Scientists now hail insects as nutritional powerhouses. Crickets contain more protein per gram than beef. Mealworms are packed with omega-3s, and ant larvae offer iron levels that rival spinach. In Oaxaca, Mexico, roasted grasshoppers tossed with chili and lime are a beloved snack, while Thai street vendors serve crispy bamboo worms like popcorn. The United Nations has even endorsed entomophagy, the fancy term for bug eating, as a sustainable solution to global food shortages, yet the cultural whiplash is undeniable. Where ancient civilizations saw immortality, many modern diners still recoil at the thought of a six-legged appetizer. The irony: many of us already unknowingly consume insects daily, ground into flour, hidden in food coloring, or as natural contaminants in fruits and vegetables. The real barrier isn't nutrition or safety, it's millennia of conditioned disgust. But as climate change forces us to rethink our diets, those age-old cicada elixirs might not have been so far off after all. The next time you squirm at a sushi roll garnished with ants, remember, your ancestors would have called it the fountain of youth. If you lived in the 19th century, taking a stroll under the moonlight wasn't just romantic, it was downright reckless. Victorians were utterly convinced that night air carried deadly miasmas, invisible poisons that lurked in the darkness and brought disease into homes with every breeze. This wasn't just a mild superstition. It shaped how entire generations designed their homes, raised their children, and even treated the sick. Families slept with windows tightly sealed, hospitals designed wards without ventilation, and doctors prescribed fresh air only during strictly daylight hours. The result: stifling, oxygen-starved rooms where illness actually flourished, all in the name of avoiding an invisible threat that didn't even exist. The roots of this fear ran deep. Long before germ theory, people blamed illnesses on bad air, malaria in Italian, the origin of the word malaria. Night air was considered especially dangerous because it was heavy with dew, which was thought to carry down toxic vapors from swamps or rotting waste. Even Florence Nightingale, the pioneer of modern nursing, initially believed in miasma theory, insisting that foul odors directly caused disease. Her famous Crimean War hospital reforms focused more on scrubbing walls with disinfectant to purify the air than on sterilizing instruments, missing the real culprit: bacteria. Wealthier Victorians took extreme measures to guard against nighttime threats. Homes were built with high windows to keep night air out, and sleeping porches, enclosed outdoor spaces, became status symbols for those who could afford to safely take the air. Parents tucked children into beds draped with thick curtains, creating sweatbox conditions that worsened respiratory illnesses. In tuberculosis sanatoriums, where patients desperately needed fresh air, doctors instead kept windows shut tight, unwittingly trapping the bacteria-laden droplets that spread the disease. The irony was tragic. The very precautions meant to protect people were making them sicker. The turnaround came with Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch's work in the late 19th century, proving that microbes, not mystical vapors, caused disease. Suddenly, night air wasn't the enemy, germs were. Yet old habits died hard. Even after the science was clear, many clung to the miasma myth well into the 20th century. Some rural communities still hung garlic or herbs to purify night air, and the phrase, "don't let the night air in," lingered in folk wisdom. It took pandemics like the 1918 flu to finally shatter the superstition, as public health campaigns urged open windows to disperse germs. What's fascinating isn't just how wrong they were, it's how logical their fears seemed at the time. Without microscopes, the idea of unseen poisons in damp air made intuitive sense. And in a twisted way, they weren't entirely off base. Mosquitoes, which thrive at night, did spread malaria. But the real lesson here is about the cost of misplaced certainty. For decades, the miasma myth delayed medical progress and worsened suffering, all because people trusted what they knew over what they couldn't yet see. It's a reminder that even our most deeply held beliefs might one day seem as absurd as sealing a window against the stars. For centuries, the dream of drinking from a spring that could turn back time wasn't just a fantasy. It was a mission that drove kings, conquerors, and explorers to risk everything. The most famous seeker, Spanish conquistador Juan Ponce de Leon, allegedly sailed to the New World in 1513 with explicit orders to find the mythical fountain of youth. Legends claimed these waters could restore vitality to the elderly, erase wrinkles, and even bring the dead back to life. But what's fascinating isn't just the absurdity of the belief, it's how stubbornly it persisted across cultures, long before Ponce de Leon ever set sail. The roots of this obsession stretch back thousands of years. Ancient Greek writers like Herodotus spoke of a magical spring in Ethiopia that granted astonishing longevity, while Alexander the Great supposedly searched for a river of paradise with similar powers. In the Middle Ages, rumors swirled about Prester John, a mythical Christian king in Asia whose lands contained a pool of youth, waters so potent that a single sip could add decades to one's life. These stories weren't just whimsical tales, they reflected a deep, almost primal fear of decay and death. For societies without modern medicine, where lifespans were short and aging was brutal, the idea of a quick fix wasn't just tempting, it was intoxicating. Ponce de Leon's quest, though, took the myth to new heights. Contrary to popular belief, he never explicitly mentioned the Fountain of Youth in his logs. Historians suspect the legend was embellished later by rivals to mock his failures. But the allure was too powerful to dismiss. Indigenous peoples in the Caribbean spoke of rejuvenating waters, and Spanish settlers eagerly conflated these tales with their own folklore. Expeditions were launched, swamps were dredged, and countless lives were lost, all chasing a mirage. The irony: Ponce de Leon died from a poisoned arrow in Florida, his body aging normally like anyone else's. Yet the myth refused to die. In the 1800s, Florida became a hotspot for health tourism, with entrepreneurs bottling mineral water from springs and marketing it as Fountain of Youth elixirs. Even today, tourists flock to St. Augustine's Ponce de Leon Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park to sip sulfur-smelling water from a well dug centuries after the conquistador's death. Modern science, of course, confirms no such magic exists, but the deeper truth is that humanity's obsession wasn't really about water, it was about control. To believe in the fountain was to believe that death wasn't inevitable, that nature's laws could be cheated. What's striking is how this ancient dream has simply evolved. Today, we chase immortality through Silicon Valley cryonics, telomere-lengthening pills, or genetic engineering. The packaging is different, but the longing remains the same. The Fountain of Youth was never a place, it was a mirror, reflecting our timeless refusal to accept the one fate every living thing shares. And in that sense, maybe the legend was right all along. The real magic wasn't in the water, it was in the desperate, beautiful hope that kept people searching. For thousands of years, a shimmering streak of light across the night sky wasn't just a celestial curiosity, it was a cosmic death threat. Comets, with their fiery tails and unpredictable appearances, were the ultimate bad omen, striking terror into civilizations from ancient China to medieval Europe. These hairy stars, as the Greeks called them, weren't just atmospheric oddities, they were viewed as divine warning signs, heralding everything from plagues to fallen empires. When Halley's comet blazed across the sky in 1066, chroniclers in England declared it a sure sign of William the Conqueror's impending victory, and they weren't wrong. The comet became forever tied to the Norman invasion, proving how tightly people linked these cosmic visitors to earthly chaos. One of the most dramatic examples comes from ancient Rome. When a comet appeared shortly after Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, his adopted heir Octavian, later Emperor Augustus, seized the moment, proclaiming the celestial display was Caesar's soul ascending to godhood. The Senate even built a temple honoring the comet star, turning fear into propaganda. But not all rulers were so savvy. Emperor Nero, upon spotting a comet in 60 AD, panicked and ordered the execution of Rome's leading aristocrats, convinced the heavens demanded blood to avert disaster. His paranoia backfired, fueling the rebellion that eventually toppled him. The hysteria peaked in 1910 when Earth passed through Halley's comet's tail. Newspapers worldwide warned that poisonous cyanogen gas in the tail would suffocate humanity, sparking a global panic. People sealed their windows with tape, bought comet pills from charlatans, and in Oklahoma, a group even attempted to sacrifice a virgin to appease the skies until police intervened. The absurdity didn't end there. Entrepreneurs sold anti-comet umbrellas, while astronomers reassured the public that the tail's gases were too thin to harm anyone. The real danger wasn't in the comet, it was in the chaos humans created interpreting it. What's fascinating is how these fears weren't entirely irrational. Before modern astronomy, comets really were unpredictable. Unlike planets which followed orderly orbits, comets arrived unannounced, blazing spectacularly before vanishing for generations. They defied the ancient belief in a perfect, unchanging cosmos, and in a world where kings claimed divine mandates, a cosmic wild card threatened the very order of society. Even famed astronomer Tycho Brahe initially dismissed the idea that comets were celestial bodies, insisting they were atmospheric phenomena because accepting otherwise would upend Aristotelian physics. The turning point came with Edmund Halley's realization in 1705 that comets followed predictable orbits, marking the beginning of the end for their supernatural reputation. Yet the old fears didn't die quietly. As recently as 1997, 39 members of the Heaven's Gate cult took their own lives, believing a comet trailing the Hale-Bopp comet was their ticket to salvation. Even now, when comets grace our skies, there's a whisper of that ancient awe, not of terror, but of wonder at how far we've come. Once seen as divine firebrands, they're now recognized for what they truly are: breathtaking remnants of the solar system's birth, carrying secrets of our cosmic origins instead of doom. Here's a widespread myth you've probably heard. Before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, everyone thought the Earth was flat, and brave explorers like him proved it was round. It's a great story, except it's completely false. The idea that medieval people believed in a flat Earth is one of history's most stubborn misconceptions. In reality, educated scholars had known the Earth was spherical for over 1,000 years before Columbus ever set foot on a ship. The truth starts with the ancient Greeks. As early as the 6th century BC, philosopher Pythagoras argued for a round Earth based on the shape of the moon's shadow during eclipses. By the 4th century BC, Aristotle had compiled even more evidence: ships disappearing hull first over the horizon, different stars visible from different latitudes, and the Earth's curved shadow on the moon. These weren't fringe ideas, they became the foundation of astronomy. The brilliant mathematician and geographer Eratosthenes went further in the 3rd century BC, calculating the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy using just sticks, shadows, and geometry. His estimate was within a few hundred miles of the correct figure, a feat that wouldn't be matched for centuries. So where did the flat Earth myth come from? Blame a 19th century fabrication. Washington Irving's 1828 biography of Columbus, more fiction than fact, popularized the idea that superstitious medieval clergy opposed Columbus over fears he'd sail off the edge of the world. In truth, Columbus's critics weren't flat earthers. They simply thought he'd underestimated the distance to Asia, which he had by thousands of miles. The real debate was over size, not shape. Even the Catholic Church, often painted as the villain of this myth, had long accepted the Earth's roundness. Saint Augustine wrote about it in the 5th century, and by the Middle Ages, globes appeared in royal courts and universities across Europe. The irony. The few who did argue for a flat Earth were outliers, often dismissed even in their own time. The 6th century monk Cosmas Indicopoulos, for instance, proposed a bizarre rectangular cosmos based on biblical symbolism, but his ideas were ignored outside small religious circles. Meanwhile, medieval textbooks like De Sphera Mundi taught spherical Earth theory to students, complete with diagrams showing planetary motion. Sailors navigating by the stars knew the truth, as did anyone who'd seen a lunar eclipse or watched a ship vanish into the distance. What's fascinating isn't just how wrong the myth is, but how it flips history on its head. The real story isn't about ignorant people learning the Earth was round. It's about centuries of knowledge being overshadowed by a modern fable. Columbus didn't prove the Earth was spherical. He stumbled onto continents Europeans didn't know existed. And that's the real lesson here. Sometimes the myths we believe about the past say more about us than they do about history. We like to think we're smarter than our ancestors, but the truth is, they knew more than we often give them credit for. The flat Earth myth persists because it's comforting. It lets us feel superior. But history, like the planet itself, is rarely that simple. Deep in the tangled folklore of medieval Europe grew a plant so feared, so steeped in legend, that even seasoned herbalists approached it with trembling hands: the mandrake root. With its twisted, often eerily human-like shape, this unassuming plant was believed to possess supernatural powers, along with a deadly scream capable of killing anyone who dared harvest it. Ancient texts describe the mandrake as a living thing, half plant, half human, its roots forming crude imitations of male or female bodies. Some even claimed these roots bled when cut, or that they writhed in the soil like trapped creatures. But the most persistent myth, the one that turned gathering mandrake into a life or death ritual, was its lethal cry. The terror surrounding mandrake harvesting wasn't just superstition, it had elaborate instructions. To safely uproot one, medieval herbalists advised tying a dog to the plant, then standing back while blowing a horn to drown out the scream as the dog pulled it free. According to legend, the root's shriek would kill the animal instantly, sparing the human collector. Manuscripts like the Herbarium Apuleius Platonicus warned that careless handlers would suffer madness, strokes, or even spontaneous combustion. The myth was so pervasive that Shakespeare referenced it in Romeo and Juliet, with Juliet's desperate soliloquy about the shrieks like mandrakes torn out of the earth. But why such hysteria over a root? The answer lies in its potent and very real chemical properties. Mandrake contains scopolamine and atropine, powerful alkaloids that induce hallucinations, paralysis, or death in high doses. Ancient healers used it as anesthesia, poison, and even as a sinister love potion, but its unpredictable effects likely fueled the supernatural rumors. When overdosed patients described nightmarish visions or fell into death-like trances, it's no wonder people believed the plant itself was cursed. The mandrake's humanoid shape only deepened the mystique. Folklore claimed they sprouted beneath gallows from the semen of hanged men, and that they emitted faint moans at night. German traditions said witches shaped mandrakes into dolls for spells, while Jewish mysticism associated them with golems. Even the scientific name, mandragora, evokes the Greek mandra stable and agora assembly, a nod to its supposed habit of growing where demons gathered. What's truly fascinating is how long the myth held sway. Well into the Renaissance, physicians like Paracelsus carried mandrake charms, and apothecaries sold fake roots carved from bryony to meet demand. The scream itself may have been an auditory illusion, wind whistling through uprooted tendrils, or the groans of uprooting dogs mistaken for the plant's voice. Yet the fear was real enough that when Carl Linnaeus classified mandrake in the 18th century, he felt compelled to debunk the scream as pure fiction. Today, we recognize mandrake as just another toxic nightshade, but its legend lingers in fantasy literature, from Harry Potter's screaming seedlings to video game alchemy. The real horror wasn't the plant, it was our ancestors' vivid imaginations, turning nature's dangers into tales so chilling they outlived the science that disproved them. Next time you see a gnarled root, remember, in another era, it might have sent entire villages running. For centuries, the sight of a lightning bolt splitting the sky was more than a natural phenomenon. It was the wrath of God made visible. And nowhere was this divine fury believed to strike more frequently than the towering spires of churches. Medieval Europe clung to the terrifying conviction that lightning targeted holy buildings as punishment for the sins of their congregations. When a bolt shattered a cathedral's roof or set its wooden beams ablaze, priests interpreted it as a celestial rebuke, a warning to repent before worse calamities followed. The aftermath was often a flurry of penitent processions, stricter tithes, and sometimes even the public humiliation of clergy deemed insufficiently holy. This belief wasn't just passive fear, it shaped architecture and theology. Bell towers, the tallest structures in most towns, became lightning magnets, yet their iron bells were rung during storms in a desperate attempt to scatter evil spirits thought to ride the thunderclouds. The results were predictably disastrous. In Germany alone, over 100 bell ringers were killed by lightning in the 1700s, their charred bodies only reinforcing the idea that churches were under supernatural siege. Theologians pored over ancient texts, arguing whether lightning was God's anger or the devil's mischief, while architects piled on gargoyles and crosses in a futile attempt to ward off strikes. Then came Benjamin Franklin. In 1752, his famous kite experiment proved lightning was simply electricity, a natural force that followed predictable laws, not divine whims. But his real revolution was the lightning rod, a humble metal strip that could safely divert strikes away from buildings. When Franklin suggested installing them on churches, the backlash was immediate. Prominent clergy like Boston's Reverend Thomas Prince warned that intercepting lightning would rob God of his arrows, inviting worse retribution. Others insisted rods were blasphemous, arguing that if God willed a church to burn, humans shouldn't interfere. The turning point came in 1769 when a bolt struck Venice's Church of St. Mark, a building packed with gunpowder stores. The resulting explosion killed 3,000 people and leveled the neighborhood. Suddenly, Franklin's rods didn't seem so radical. Even the Vatican, after initial resistance, quietly installed them over St. Peter's Basilica. The irony was rich. The very institution that once interpreted lightning as divine judgment now relied on science to protect its holiest site. What's most revealing about this story isn't just the triumph of reason over superstition, it's how deeply fear had twisted logic. For generations, no one questioned why lightning also struck barns, trees, and castles if it was truly targeting sin. The answer was hiding in plain sight. Churches weren't being punished, they were simply the tallest structures around. Franklin's breakthrough wasn't just about electricity. It exposed how easily humans conflate the random with the meaningful. Today, lightning rods are mundane fixtures, but their legacy sparks a timeless question. What other modern, divine punishments might just be physics waiting to be understood? For over 2,000 years, the dream of transforming worthless lead into gleaming gold wasn't just a fantasy. It was the driving force behind one of history's most fascinating and misunderstood disciplines, alchemy. At the heart of this quest lay the legendary philosopher's stone, a substance rumored to possess not only the power of transmutation but also the secret to eternal life. What began as a mystical pursuit in the smoky labs of ancient Egypt and Arabia evolved into something far more profound, a bridge between magic and science that would ultimately lay the foundations for modern chemistry. The allure of the philosopher's stone wasn't just about wealth. To alchemists, the transformation of base metals into gold symbolized something far grander: the purification of the human soul. Just as lead, dull and corruptible, could be perfected into incorruptible gold, so too could the flawed mortal ascend to spiritual perfection. This idea resonated across cultures, from Chinese Taoist alchemists seeking immortality elixirs to medieval European scholars laboring in candlelit workshops, their texts filled with cryptic symbols and elaborate allegories. The famed Swiss alchemist Paracelsus claimed the stone could cure any disease, while the enigmatic Nicholas Flamel supposedly discovered its secrets, using it to amass untold riches before faking his own death to escape scrutiny. But the real magic of alchemy wasn't in its failures, it was in its unexpected successes. While no one ever turned lead into gold, alchemists pioneered laboratory techniques still used today. Distillation, crystallization, and the discovery of acids like nitric and sulfuric acid all emerged from their experiments. When Robert Boyle, often called the father of modern chemistry, began his work in the 17th century, he built directly on alchemical traditions, even as he sought to strip away their mystical trappings. Isaac Newton, too, was a devoted alchemist, filling notebooks with coded recipes for the philosopher's stone, proof that the line between magic and science was once blurrier than we like to admit. What's most striking about this centuries-long obsession isn't its futility, but its persistence. Kings and popes funded alchemists, desperate for the economic and military advantage unlimited gold could bring. Charlatans exploited this desperation, like the infamous Count Cagliostro, who swindled European courts with promises of transmutation. Yet amid the fraud and folly, genuine curiosity flourished. The alchemist's lab, with its bubbling flasks and cryptic manuscripts, was a crucible of innovation, a place where the boundaries of knowledge were tested, sometimes disastrously, but always ambitiously. The philosopher's stone may have been a myth, but its legacy is very real. Modern particle accelerators can now transmute elements, albeit in microscopic quantities, proving the ancients weren't entirely wrong, just impossibly ahead of their time. And perhaps that's the true lesson of this enduring quest. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries aren't the ones we seek, but the ones we stumble upon while searching for something else entirely. The alchemists never found eternal life or infinite wealth, but they unlocked something far more lasting: the very method by which humanity would come to understand the building blocks of the universe. To ancient civilizations, the sun wasn't just a ball of burning gas. It was a living deity, the very heartbeat of existence. In Egypt, Ra sailed his golden boat across the sky each day, battling the serpent Apophis to bring light to the world. The Inca revered in Tai the sun god whose warmth sustained their empire, while the Aztecs offered sacrifices to Huitzilopochtli, fearing the sun would vanish without human blood to fuel its journey. Japan's Amaterasu hid in a cave, plunging the world into darkness until lured out by laughter and dance. These weren't just myths, they were frameworks for understanding life itself, explaining the cycles of day and night, harvest and famine, with a celestial drama that placed humanity at the center of the cosmos. What's striking isn't just the ubiquity of sun worship, it's the logic behind it. For societies dependent on agriculture, the sun's return each morning wasn't guaranteed. Solar eclipses, droughts, or prolonged winters could mean starvation, so rituals emerged to appease the capricious god. The ancient Mesopotamians performed daily hymns to Shamash, keeper of justice and light, while Norse legends told of Skoll and Hati, wolves eternally chasing the sun, destined to devour it during Ragnarök. Even Stonehenge, with its solstice alignments, reveals how deeply early cultures tied their survival to tracking the sun's movements. The sun wasn't merely observed, it was bargained with, celebrated, and feared. The shift from divinity to science began with moments of quiet observation. Greek thinkers like Anaxagoras dared to suggest the sun was a fiery rock, not a god, a claim so scandalous he was exiled for impiety. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model in the 3rd century BC, but without telescopes, proof was elusive. It took the Renaissance and pioneers like Galileo, armed with new tools, to peel back the layers of myth. Spectroscopy in the 19th century revealed the sun's chemical composition, and nuclear physics later unveiled its true nature. A fusion reactor converting hydrogen into helium, its light the byproduct of atomic collisions. Yet the old awe never fully faded. Modern solar probes like NASA Parker Solar Probe, flying closer to the sun than any spacecraft before, evoke the same reverence once reserved for Ra's chariot. We no longer offer sacrifices, but we still personify the sun in language, art, and even advertisements: golden, life-giving, the ultimate power source. The difference is we now understand its power not as magic but as physics. That transformation from god to star is perhaps humanity's greatest collective leap in understanding. We traded stories of divine boats for equations of nuclear fusion, yet the sun's hold on our imagination remains as unshakable as its gravity. It's no longer a deity, but in a way that makes its brilliance even more miraculous. From cosmic turtles holding up the earth to medieval animal trials, powdered mummy medicine, and wandering wombs, we've journeyed through 25 of history's most jaw-dropping beliefs, ideas that once shaped lives, laws, and even entire civilizations. Each one reveals the same humbling truth. What seems undeniable today might be tomorrow's punchline. Our ancestors weren't foolish. They worked with the best knowledge they had, cobbling together explanations for a world far more mysterious to them than it is to us. And yet, here's the kicker. Future generations will doubtless look back at our era and gasp at the things we got wildly wrong. Imagine historians centuries from now scrolling through our social media feeds, baffled by our once popular trends. Wait, they injected botulism toxin into their foreheads to smooth wrinkles. And they thought almond milk was a radical innovation. They'll laugh at our obsession with gluten-free diets for non-celiacs, our blind faith in algorithmic horoscopes disguised as personalized wellness tips, or the fact that some people genuinely believed drinking colloidal silver would turn them into immortal smurfs. And let's not even get started on the early 21st century conviction that a two-dimensional, flat Earth was somehow a valid debate, but that's the beauty of human progress. We're always stumbling toward better understanding, shedding old misconceptions like outgrown skins. The real lesson here isn't to mock the past, it's to stay curious, question assumptions, and maybe chuckle at the thought that someday our dearly held beliefs will sound just as bizarre. So tell me in the comments, which of these historical oddballs shocked you the most? Was it the witch trials for limp masculinity, the radium smoothies, or the tomato terror? And who knows, maybe you'll spot a modern myth in the making. If you love unraveling history's weirdest twists, hit subscribe and join me for more deep dives into the mysteries we thought we'd solved. After all, the only thing stranger than fiction is the truth we haven't uncovered yet.